Welcome to EWTN News Nightly. I'm Colleen Carroll Campbell. Tonight's show is a special edition to mark the 12th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We'll talk to witnesses at the Pentagon and White House about what they saw that day. We'll hear from one of America's best-known pollsters about whatever became of the 9/11 religious revival. And we'll talk to one of America's most outspoken bishops about the role of religion in our post-9/11 nation and world. Thanks for joining us for this special edition of EWTN News Nightly. Today, America and the world marked the 12th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. Those attacks, coordinated by a group of 19 radical Islamist hijackers, were the deadliest ever on American soil. They claimed nearly 3,000 lives. Americans gathered today in communities across the nation to remember the victims and the heroes who died trying to save them. At Ground Zero in New York, a family members only ceremony was held at the site of the fallen Twin Towers, which is where the majority of 9/11 victims, some 2,700, perished. The site is now a national September 11th memorial and museum. In Arlington, Virginia, a moment of silence was held to remember the 184 victims killed at the Pentagon. The National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial also hosted a family members only event that was later open to the public. And in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 crashed, there was an observance ceremony and a reading of the passengers' names. 12 years is, in many ways, a long time. The newborns who lost a mom or dad on 9/11 are now in middle school. The heightened security measures enacted after 9/11, from lengthy airport screenings to blockades in front of public buildings, are now a fact of American life. And an entire generation has grown up in the shadow of an ongoing international war on terror. But for those who experienced the fallout of those terrorist attacks firsthand, 9/11 is a not-so-distant memory. Joining me today to talk about what he saw is Father Stephen McGraw, a priest of the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia. Father Steve was on the scene minutes after the plane crashed into the Pentagon on September 11th. Also joining me is Timothy Gagline, who was serving as Deputy Director for the Office of Public Liaison in the White House at the time. He's the author of The Man in the Middle, an inside account of faith and politics in the George W. Bush era. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Colleen.
And Father Steve, I'll start with you. So set the scene for our viewers. Where exactly were you on 9/11 when all of this began?
Well, I was just finished saying a morning mass for our school children at Corpus Christi School in Falls Church, and was on my way in a hurry to Arlington National Cemetery for a graveside service. And when I found myself in standstill traffic right in front of the Pentagon building, which is precisely when the plane flew low over our cars on Route 27 there and crashed right into the building.
And what was your reaction seeing a plane crash into the Pentagon?
Well, I hadn't heard anything about the World Trade Center crashes at all.
Okay.
And when I was 16, the Air Florida crash in D.C. that struck the 14th Street Bridge was a memory that I still had with me. And so it was just like a tragic accident was what I thought it was. And so I just got out of my car and made my way across the traffic. It was still not going anywhere, and over the guardrail, and was on the lawn, the far side of the Pentagon lawn, when the handful of injured people were able to get out and be brought out to where I was and where the medics were attending to them.
Now, you were a new priest at the time. You'd only been ordained 3 months earlier. So what made you get out of your car and run toward the site of this instead of, keep driving or just go home and figure out what's going on first?
There was another encounter about 6 weeks earlier with another seriously injured person by an ambulance on the stretcher by the side of the road with the head bandaged, and I didn't stop. I just kind of went on. It was my day off, and that was really a very strong memory, because I remember resolving that I was always going to stop from then on if I could at a serious accident. And I felt really bad about that and just asked for God's mercy on them and on me, and it was about 6 weeks later that September 11th occurred. So it was like a no-brainer to just get out of the car and go onto the lawn and help people.
So you jump over this guardrail, you get there, and what are you seeing around you?
Well, I think I was initially just pacing back and forth, not knowing what to do with explosions still popping, but very quickly I found that there were just a handful of injured people that had been made it across the lawn, and was able to be with just one after another. And as the medics very quickly came on the scene as well, just praying with them, or rather more, just saying to them, is what I recall, Jesus is with you. That's the phrase that kept coming to me, and I kept saying to one after another, and I remember more than one person saying back, yes, that he was. And then one woman I remember asking to tell my mother and father that I loved them. I later found out that she passed away, and I was able to fulfill that eventually. But then also a Catholic man, identified himself as Catholic, and I was able to give him the anointing of the sick also at the scene there.
And you later reunited with him, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. He survived. I later found out that he had made it through, and had kept saying, Jesus is praying. I mean, someone was praying. Someone was praying. He kept saying over and over.
Wow. Now, Tim, you were also in a pivotal place on 9/11. You were working in the White House. Obviously,
Yes.
it wasn't attacked, but it was a real center of attention. What are your experiences from that day?
Well, I had gone to a breakfast across the Lafayette Square from the White House, and came back almost exactly at 9 o'clock because our office, Public Liaison, was sponsoring a meeting with the President that day. Okay. And of all groups, we had a meeting with the American Association of Christian Schools. And they were going to be seeing the President when he came back from Florida later in the day. I distinctively remember through a series of events, and I've written about this, called Lightning Out of a Clear Blue Sky in my book. I remember vividly trailing out of the White House, going on to 17th Street near Pennsylvania Avenue, watching the cars go each way as fast as they could. It was mayhem. And I later saw one of the most remarkable things that I've ever witnessed in my life. Which was that this group from the American Association of Christian Schools, which was going to be coming to the White House later in the day, while everybody was running away, Colleen, from the White House, they were coming toward the White House because they were extemporaneously reaching out to people who were in a sense of panic and offering to pray with them on the street corner near the White House. It was really a remarkable thing.
And we saw so much of that public prayer in the days after 9/11. We don't have much time left, but Tim, you helped organize the national service at the National Cathedral that brought Americans together.
Yes.
September 14th, Feast of Triumph of the Cross for Catholics, and
yes.
George W. Bush, of course, delivered a very memorable address. What was your sense of what was going on in those first few days after 9/11?
It was a combination of disbelief and a sense of duty, because the President felt instinctively in those first 24 hours that one of the things that we needed to do was have a national day of prayer and remembrance. This is in the deepest DNA of the President. And that's what we did. And so for essentially 2.5 and almost 3 days, the working group, and I was part of a team, essentially didn't sleep. And we brought, the Cardinal of Washington, obviously Dr. Billy Graham, and I could go on and on. I mean, it was really a coming together. And in that sense, in the middle of this great, great tragedy, what some had said would be the Pearl Harbor of our generation, something remarkable came out of that. I think God was really lifted up in a very significant way.
And Father Steve, just real quickly, we've seen some of that dissipate. Obviously, that kind of intense fervor didn't hang on real long. But have you seen any gradual change, any more lasting change among those you minister to?
I don't know that I have, that I can at least discern tangibly. It seems to me that sometimes what's missing is a sense of bowing humbly under God's mighty hand. And that He will lift you on high. I think sometimes we need to have that sense of the strength that we have coming from God, and in times of crisis like this, to be ready to have Him be the one to raise us up and when we've been humbled by a terrible, tragic event like this. And I hope we can do that still.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
One of the most remarked upon after effects of 9/11 was the religious revival we saw in the weeks after the attacks. Americans seemed to be turning to prayer and public worship as never before. So whatever happened to that religious revival? And how has religion in America changed in the wake of this seminal event? Here to talk about the hard facts behind the religious trends we've seen in post-9/11 America is Dr. Frank Newport. Frank is the editor-in-chief of the Gallup Research Organization and author of the book, God is Alive and Well, The Future of Religion in America. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Glad to have you here. Let's start with this question that I think a lot of folks have asked in the last 12 years. What happened to that upsurge in religious devotion that we seem to see in the wake of the attacks? Where did it go?
Well, it was temporary. As is often the case with a lot of things that we track in our survey research, we did see an uptick in some indicators after 9/11, but it didn't take too long for those to dissipate. And I would say now, here in 2013, looking back, there's no evidence that 9/11 had any impact on our long-standing indicators of religiosity in this country.
And so where is America headed in the wake of 9/11? I mean, even if this event didn't shift things fundamentally, where were things headed that they've kind of stayed on that trajectory?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, I write about it a lot, looking at all these trends. But
Right.
in general, I think there's stability out there in Americans' religion. We had a lot of changes in demography in this country, a lot of people getting older, in migration of people from Latin America in particular, and a lot of changes like that. But a lot of our core indicators have stayed quite stable. Among those would be the self-reported importance of religion in one's own personal life, and also religious service attendance. Those have stayed fairly constant. The one measure that has changed a lot has been the so-called nuns. Now, when I say that, people think I'm thinking about N-U-N-S, right? But instead it's N-O-N-E-S. People who, when we say, what is your religious identity, you know, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, something else, they say none. And that's gone even since 9/11. That's at least doubled and is now up to, 18% or even higher in some surveys, and used to be in single digits. And back in the 1950s, down to like 1%. So we have seen an increase there. But my research and research of other people cast some doubts on whether or not that really means Americans are becoming less religious. They're just becoming more honest about reporting that they don't have a full religious identity at the time we catch them when we interview them.
And I think the common perception with the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is that that means they're atheists. But I know I saw in your book that we're talking maybe 18% of the population taking that label of nun, but only 5 to 6% of those actually don't believe in God. The rest just don't want to claim any specific religious affiliation, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe.
That's absolutely right. And there have been some other research that shows some of them at any rate are still looking for spiritual solutions to problems and so forth. What I really think is happening is these are the same people we had with us decades previously, but in the past they hid behind their religious identity because it wasn't socially acceptable to say you didn't have a religion. So let's take a Catholic, for example, who never attended Mass and wasn't very religious, but when we called them up, let's say in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they would just say, oh, I'm a Catholic. But nowadays, because of change in norms in society, I think the same person feels freer to say into the phone when we interview them, I don't have a religious identity. So I don't think that much has changed underneath it all. There's just what I would call a truth in labeling, where people who before kept the identity of their parents now are more likely to say they personally don't identify as a Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish because they're not active.
Looking forward, do you expect to see religion on a downward trend, which we often hear is the case, as we grow more secularized, we are going to grow more secularized and therefore, that's the direction things are headed? Or do you have a little more optimistic take from what you're seeing of the data?
I have a little more optimistic take looking at the data. Let me give you a couple of reasons why. One is the baby boomers. The number of 65-plus Americans is going to double over the next 20 years, and 65-plus is the most religious category in America. So you've got twice as many people that are going to be seeking religion in that sense. Second, I think there's a well-documented relationship between religion and well-being, happiness, and health that we're going to become more aware of, and I think more Americans are going to entertain religion than have, because they say, wait a minute, this looks like it actually could be good for me. Good for the soul, but also good for my body as well. So that's a trend. Another implication of religious trends are fertility and marital rates, which have been down, but they're leveling off. So if people start having more babies again and get married at a higher rate, we don't know about that, that could be positive for religion as well.
Well, plenty to watch. Thank you so much, Dr. Newport, for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
We have to run to a break right now, but stay with us on EWTN News Nightly. Welcome back to EWTN News Nightly. I'm Colleen Carroll Campbell. Tonight's show is a special edition dedicated to marking the 12th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and to exploring their enduring effects on America and beyond. With me today to discuss the effects of 9/11 from an international perspective is Austin Roos, the president of the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute. CFAM, as it's known, is a research institute that has participated in every major social policy debate at the UN since 1997. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you.
Great to have you on the show. Let's start with the actual day, 9/11. You were in New York that day. Tell us what you saw.
I was in my office right next to the UN when it hit. I did the dumbest thing possible. I went straight to the UN, which is obviously a target. Was party to, a witness to some anti-American comments in the cafeteria there, which was odd on that particular day. And just spent the day all over New York City watching the most remarkable unfolding events of our time.
Right. Does that stay with you now, 12 years later?
Oh, it will always stay with me. You know, there were parked cars and people gathered around listening to the radio news and sorties of jets flying overhead and thousands of people walking north away from the site and some covered in ash. It was a remarkable day, and I'll never forget it.
Now let's talk a little bit about your work at the UN. You work on social policy. Your institute is very explicitly and unapologetically pro-life, pro-family, standing with the teachings of the Catholic Church on these issues. So you're addressing hot-button social issues often. And you're doing so often in coalitions that include Muslims, many Muslims. So tell us a little more about that interfaith effort and how that's been impacted by 9/11 and the subsequent events.
Well, you know, 9/11 didn't really hurt us at the United Nations with regard to the Muslims. Well, first, you should know that it's unfortunate that at the UN, our coalition is so small on the life issues. You know, it ought to include democracies, you know, but sadly, most of the democracies have gone the other way. And so we work with who works with us.
You mean when you're opposing abortion or euthanasia? Or?
Yeah, it's you know, the Holy See, of course, is the leader, but the most vocal states, other than the Holy See, tend to be Muslim countries. And so we have found that it's been a remarkably rewarding experience for us as an institution and also as individuals, because it's an opportunity for us to provide a profound Christian witness of love to these men and women from countries, some of whom persecute Christians.
And how do you answer critics who call this an unholy alliance, say pro-life Christian groups should not be aligning themselves with Islamic states that often persecute Christians or at least don't tolerate much religious freedom? Well,
we tend to do our work with the Muslim states behind closed doors. I mean, there's certain states that we wouldn't go to their capital, for instance, and appear on television. So mostly it is behind closed doors, but not always, not always. I mean, we've worked very publicly with Egypt, for instance, for many, many years. And it has been the coalition that John Paul the Great founded at the United Nations of Christian nations and Muslim nations has been able to stop an international right to abortion. Full stop. It's been a very potent coalition of states and non-governmental actors that have stopped an international right to abortion. And this is mostly because of John Paul the Great and what he founded at the Cairo Conference in 1994.
And then how from 1994 to fast forward to 2001, when September 11th has just erupted right in the UN's backyard, so to speak, in New York. What was that like then, going back to that work with Muslims? I mean, what were their attitudes? How did you discuss it?
The thing that changed in our work was not necessarily 9/11. It was the beginning of the Iraq War. And so there was a real pivot. Recall that it was the Bush administration. They were very pro-life, but they were also prosecuting a war in Iraq, which the Muslim world found offensive. So even though the Muslims agreed with the Bush administration on certain pro-life issues, they refused to work with them. So our coalition fell apart for a while, actually for a good long while.
And where is it today, especially as we're looking at brewing conflicts in Syria and Egypt, other places where the U.S. may get involved?
We're very fortunate, if that's the right word, in that we have such a pro-abortion president in the White House. So it has driven the Muslims back into a very vocal opposition to what this administration is doing on the life issues and also the family issues. This administration is very aggressive on homosexual marriage at the UN and around the world. So the coalition has grown and actually gotten stronger. With the addition of Russia. Russia has become very outspoken on these issues at the United Nations as well.
Finally, what would you say to someone who says, you know, you're dealing with radicals, and faith that is that strong and ardent on these social issues is necessarily divisive? 9/11 is just proof that when religion gets too serious and people take it too seriously, terrible things happen.
Well, one of the remarkable things about the work that we do at the United Nations is all the people we work with are strong believers. You know, it's like I feel like I have more in common with a hard-nosed Calvinist than I do with a wishy-washy Catholic, if I may say so, and that we have great commonality of interest with mainstream Muslims. I don't feel like we're dealing with any radicals when we deal with Muslim governments, and we all have something. We all have skin in this particular game. That is to say, maintaining national sovereignty in the face of rapacious radicals at the United Nations who want to impose their view on the world of being able to kill unborn children, of homosexual marriage, of the grossest kind of sexual education. There are people at the United Nations who want to export these ideas to every country on the face of the earth and to every family everywhere. So we found great commonality of interest among many different religions, including the Muslims.
Interesting. Austin Roos, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Efforts to build interfaith understanding in the wake of 9/11 have spread far beyond the UN. Many American communities have made an annual tradition of bringing people of different religions together to celebrate their shared commitment to peace. Here in Washington, people of all faiths gathered this past weekend for the 9th annual 9/11 Unity Walk on Embassy Row. EWTN News Nightly's Susanna Pinto reports.
This year's 9/11 Unity Walk was kicked off by an impromptu dance party. Organizers say the walk is the nation's largest interfaith event.
As people learn more about each other and get to know each other as people, they find that they have much more in common than they realized, and that one of the commonalities of all our faiths is service.
That service could be seen in action at the Vatican's embassy, which opened its doors to participants.
Do I need to pack these up?
Marlucia Myrtle and a group from her parish put together snack bags for a homeless shelter. She was in New York on 9/11 and says faith is key to healing.
It was a day that I'll never forget. All the people who went to church, I remember that later on that day, it was the thing that brought people together.
Others also remember leaning on their faith after 9/11.
We were all very scared, and we prayed to God and gathered strength from it. So I think our faith in Jesus made a great difference.
It was very moving to see my home Catholic Church just open its doors to all as a place for healing.
Organizers of the Unity Walk say the event has gone from a solemn procession to a joyous event. That was evident this year, and they hope to keep bringing different faith communities together for years to come.
Finally tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by the Most Reverend William E. Laurie, Archbishop of Baltimore. Archbishop Laurie is chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty. He's the Supreme Chaplain for the Knights of Columbus, and he's a former bishop of Bridgeport, Connecticut, a diocese that lost dozens of Catholics in the 9/11 attacks. Welcome, Archbishop Laurie.
Thank you, Colleen. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you. Let's begin with your experiences on 9/11. Now, you had been Bishop of Bridgeport just a few months when the attacks occurred, is that right?
That's correct. When the attack occurred, I guess we all knew instantly that there would be many, many people from southwestern Connecticut, Fairfield County, who would have been in the towers. And so it was immediately apparent to all of us that many, many families would be affected, and tragically so, and that certainly turned out to be the case.
What was that like as a pastor dealing with the aftermath of this as this unfolded over weeks and months?
You know, the first thing I did is I went to meet the trains when they came back, and people came out and they were just stunned, and we had masses, and then began people who lost their loved ones. They were unaccounted for. Then began the funerals. And it was really, really heart-wrenching. I tried to call every family, visited them in the parishes, went to as many funerals as I could, and it was just heartbreaking. These were good people, innocent families, and I think the loss was irreparable.
Now, we've talked a bit on this show about that post-9/11 religious revival we saw, that, you know, where people were swarming into churches, and then within a few months you didn't see it anymore. At least it went off the radar. What was your experience of why that might have peaked and then sort of waned?
I certainly had the experience because after 9/11, I went to churches all over the place and they were packed. And that did go away quickly, unfortunately. I think because in part, for all the goodwill in the world, many people thought that simply by going to church, this terrible burden of sorrow would be instantly lifted and consolation would return. But religion and commitment to Christ and to the cross is not fast acting. It really is a lifetime commitment. And maybe there just wasn't time and opportunity to allow that to deepen and mature. That said, I still know many people who found Christ and who found the Lord and who are still practicing their faith today.
And one of the other issues that you had to deal with, and many around the country, was the clergy sex abuse crisis, which erupted January 2002. We began hearing about this. Did that also sort of divert some of those who were getting back, especially into their Catholic faith?
I'm sure it did. Imagine coming back to your faith, bearing a terrible burden of sorrow, and then this terrible crisis of sexual abuse, this very ugly specter unfolds, and the extent of it exceeds what might have been imagined before. It had a big effect, I think, on a lot of people, and that's what scandal is. It's not just shock value. It is something that prompts people who ought to believe or who believe perhaps less than robustly to turn away and to leave their faith.
Now, fast forward to today, 12 years later, you're spearheading this Committee on Religious Liberty. How have things changed in the last 12 years, and where are we now in terms of religion's role in the public square in America?
I think religious liberty has been eroding for a long time.
Before 9/11?
Oh, long before that. I think there were court decisions going back to the late 1940s that began the process, but it was hard to see because it was under the surface. I do think that as our society becomes increasingly secular, the place of religion and religious values is undergoing a seismic shift. I do think that it is not simply a set of challenges to religious liberty, which if we could but fix them all, everything would be fine. Rather, I think there are concerted efforts on the part of a lot of forces to privatize religious faith and to minimize and to hamper the ability of the church to deliver educational and charitable services according to our teaching.
And quickly, too, the international scene. We've got brewing conflicts, Syria, Christians suffering in Egypt. What has been the effect, do you think, of 9/11 on interfaith relations overseas and the situation for Christians, especially overseas?
I don't think it was ever intended, but in the course of responding to 9/11, the situation of many Christians in the Middle East grew appreciably worse. I think, for example, of the Chaldeans in Iraq. I think of what's happening right now to the Christians in Syria. Or when you think of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and the situation of the Coptic Church. We have significant, real, and serious challenges to religious freedom in our country, but we have really no idea of the terrible persecution and suffering and even martyrdom that's going on elsewhere.
Sounds like we have a lot to pray for. Thank you,
Sure
Archbishop
did,
Laurie.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Well, that's all for tonight, but be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And don't forget that you can catch the whole program again on EWTN's YouTube channel. I'm Colleen Carroll Campbell, and on behalf of all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.